Welcome everybody. Gosh, I think we have a full house, which is impressive for a Friday towards the end of December. So thank you all very much for being here. Are we online? Very good. We will formally start the meeting. So welcome to Cambridgeshire County Council Strategy and Resources Committee. The County Council allows filming and photography at its public meetings, so please feel free to take pictures and tweet during the meeting. Can I ask, though, that everyone present turns their mobile phones to silent or vibrate while the meeting is taking place? Please be aware that this meeting is being live streamed and that a recording of the meeting will be available to view on the County Council's website. There is no fire alarm test scheduled for today. If the alarm sounds at any point, I will adjourn the meeting and we will make our way downstairs out of the main building and turn left, and the muster point is at the far end of the building. Item 1 on our agenda is apologies. So, Michelle.
I've had apologies from Councillor Corney, and Councillor Costello is substituting today.
Thank you. Welcome, Adela. Does any member wish to declare a disclosable pecuniary interest or non-statutory disclosable interest? I don't see any declarations, so we will move on. But if there is any point on the agenda where people need to declare it at any time. Excuse me. Second on the agenda, we are being asked to approve the minutes of the Strategy and Resources meeting on the 20th of October as an accurate record. If any member does not agree, could you raise your hand? I see no hands, so we will assume that the accuracy of the minutes is agreed, and I will sign them in a moment. And we will move on to the updated action log, which is included in the published papers. Most of the actions are complete with an explanation next to 2, which are ongoing. And I see no Councillor Count.
Thank you, Chair. And before I forget, could I wish Merry Christmas to everybody, because I won't be seeing you again before Christmas. But yeah, hopefully the officers can clear this up on Action 103. This is about the recruitment, retention and development of the workforce, and the response is about arrangements being made with the Children's Young People's Committee, which I understand have got incredible difficulties with retaining and recruiting people. But the issues that were mentioned first of all were about the entire council workforce, which seems to have hemorrhaged staff for a while. You know, and we have difficulties in a lot of areas. So is this response saying that the Children and Young People's Committee will come up with a document that will serve the entire council, or if not, what is happening with the rest of the council in terms of their workforce development, recruitment, retention? Thank you, Chair.
Stephen, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to Councillor Count for the question and clarification. The update in the action log pertains specifically to the Children's Services social work workforce only. They won't therefore, through the CYP committee, be looking at the totality of the council's workforce. As members may be aware, our HR team are currently in the process of refreshing the council's people or workforce strategy. That's due to come forward to members early in the new year for consideration and approval. Some of the themes that the revised workforce strategy or people strategy will be focusing on recruitment and retention, as well as development of the existing staff across the whole of the council's employment base. So I hope that's helpful for Councillor Count, and will give this committee and ultimately council the opportunity to scrutinise those plans, because the strategy will need council sign off. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair, if I may. In that case, can I ask that the log is updated and it's recognised that we are talking about the problems across the entire workforce and the work that we're very concerned about goes on, so that that doesn't somehow get dropped and we're aware of it. Thank you very much, Chair and Chief Executive.
Thank you. Any other comments on the action log? Okay, I don't see any other comments, so we will move on to item 3, which is petitions and public questions. We have received one question in relation to item 9, and I propose to take the question.
Could you try again?
Sorry, I'm helpful. So I think, are we expecting the questioners here? Okay, in that case, we will move to the public question at this point, because the questioner is present. So Mrs. Mary Meakin is attending by Zoom. Mrs. Meakin, you have 3 minutes to ask your question.
Thank you. I'm showing up as Mary Ambrose, but it's Mary Meakin. I want to raise an issue surrounding the proposed sale of Mill Road Free Library in Cambridge. I wrote to a number of you about this on the 12th of December, but I apologise if I didn't manage to include all of you. Is the council aware that it's holding this property on charitable trusts in perpetuity for the local residents, and therefore
We seem to have lost Mary, which is disappointing.
and must be ring fenced and held for the purposes of the charity forever? I appreciate the council always follows internal processes, which include asking its legal team to prepare title reports and due diligence. However, unfortunately, carrying out title searches will not show up this sort of issue in many cases because trusts of property are kept off the title register. In any case, on a cursory search at HM Land Registry, there seem to be some anomalies as the registered proprietor is still showing as the Indian Community and Culture Association rather than the council. Councillor Howard kindly shared a copy of an email he received from your Assistant Director of Property, Tony Cooper. And Mr. Cooper pointed to the fact that historical records of charitable gifts of land did not necessarily translate into restrictions on the land in 2022. From one angle, that's the correct because, as I said, trusts don't normally show up on the title. On the other hand, what he says is legally incorrect. This charity was established by statute in perpetuity and it doesn't just fade away or become irrelevant over time. This may be inconvenient and a stumbling block to the proposed sale, and I have some sympathy with the council. However, its hands effectively tied, so nobody could criticise it for not selling the property because this would cut across its duty as charity trustee. Options available to the council might be to continue to hold the property on its original trusts or widen the purposes by a charity commission scheme. From experience, the commission tend to be very understanding when they're approached by local authorities facing this sort of issue. Ultimately, the best option might be to transfer the property to a local organisation that set up a charitable incorporated organisation, and they could carry on running the library and funding it in the future. In the meantime, I urge the council to put the sale on hold while its legal department looks at these issues. Can I just say that I work for an organisation called Practical Law, which fields queries from local authority lawyers and other solicitors across the country, and we get so many questions on this issue. It's very common for local authorities to be totally unaware that they hold land as charity trustee. Bearing this in mind, your legal team may want to instruct specialists in charity law to advise them further. Thank you for listening to me. And can I just say thank you to the Democratic Services team who've made participation in this meeting very easy.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Meakin. I'm afraid that we had a very slight pause in the Zoom at the very start of your question. So I'm going to ask Tom or Michelle, do you have the beginning of the question that we could just make sure that everybody got the beginning? Not for word. Mrs. Meakin, would you be willing to just read the very first few sentences of your question again?
Yes,
and then I will come back to Tom for the answer.
I just said that I wanted to raise an issue surrounding the proposed sale of Mill Road Free Library, Cambridge. And I wrote to a number of you about this on the 12th of December, and I just apologise if I didn't manage to include all of you in the email. I just want that the main point to raise is that is the council aware that it's holding this property on charitable trusts in perpetuity for the local residents, and therefore it doesn't have the power to sell it. The property was originally built on land designated for public library under the Public Libraries Act 1850, and this means that the property is in specie property and it must be ring fenced and held for those purposes. I don't know whether that's covered the bit that you missed.
Thank you very much. That's extremely helpful. Thank you very much for reading that again and clarifying. I'm now going to move to Tom Kelly, our Service Director for Finance and Procurement, to respond.
Well, thank you very much to Mary Meakin for her question and the representations to the committee and accompanying letter and research into the former Mill Road Library. The council will take full account of the information that Mary Meakin has provided. This question relates to an item on the forward agenda plan. A decision is currently scheduled for this committee on the 28th of March 2023. The County Council, through its legal advisors, as Mary Meakin has said, has obtained confirmation of title to the property and the council's ability to dispose of the property prior to the commencement of marketing. This is normal practice for any property transaction that the council is considering. The legal advice provided so far does not indicate that the council is a trustee of the property. The sale process has been underway for some time and includes the asset of community value moratorium on transactions until early February 2023. And as I say, there's no expectation this committee will take any decision before March. The County Council has asked its legal advisors to review the further information Mrs. Meakin has recently provided prior to any decisions being taken. And should the review conclude that the original confirmation of title to the property requires amendment or alteration, the council will, of course, act in accordance with that information and any associated legal advice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. I hope that's dealt with that matter satisfactorily, and thank you again, Mrs. Meakin, for your question. Councillor Howard.
Thank you. I don't know if Mary Meakin is still online. I don't want to add in any way to or comment on to the answer that's been given, but I just want to thank her as one of my constituents for taking part in the process. And I'm also very pleased that our democratic services made it easy. That's a great shining example, but also share with members of the committee that there's a strong local interest in my division about this subject. And I hope that this building, which is got a huge history and identity, will find its best use. As I say, I won't comment on the question, but I will thank everyone in my division who, like Mary, who is following this very closely and representing their views very vociferously, and look forward to that continuing.
Thank you, Richard. Yes, I'm aware that there's a great deal of interest in the future of that building, and I absolutely understand why that would be the case, because it's a very important building. Good, thank you. We will now move on to item 4, which is the annual review of the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Joint Working Agreement. And I will move to Tom again to introduce the report. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, committee. This report forms part of the governance for the operation of our shared services set up with Peterborough City Council. The large part of our joint working with Peterborough relies on section 113 of the Local Government Act 1972, and the more detailed collaboration arrangements are contained within the governing document known as the Joint Working Agreement. This report sets out that the Joint Working Agreement has been in place since 2019 and is subject to annual review. In the latest review reported here and overseen until recently by the former Director of Business Improvement and Development, there have been minor administrative updates and review from colleagues across our finance, legal, HR, IT and information governance departments. The report acknowledges that the shared arrangements with Peterborough are now in a period of contraction and focusing on a smaller number of shared services. And in that context, the addition of 2 new protocols is particularly important. Firstly, an exit protocol, which will govern our HR arrangements for when services are altered or restructured coming out of joint working, and the procurement protocol for our ongoing joint and shared procurements and how work is organised and divided between each council's respective procurement teams. The report is recommended and the joint working agreement and protocols have been reviewed by the working group and is recommended to the committee for approval and delegation to the Chief Executive to sign the final agreement. There are similar considerations happening in parallel, of course, in the next few weeks at Peterborough City Council as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. Are there any questions or comments on this? Councillor Cant.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I noticed that this report is about the joint working arrangements moving forwards, and as such, it is a definition of how those working arrangements will happen. It's not actually a summation of our journey with Peterborough, or the divorce proceedings, as I probably prefer to call it at the moment, nor does it have any financial implications, because it says how we will worked together. It doesn't actually cost how we won't or haven't worked together. So I just want to draw to this committee's attention that there's £4.5 million gone into the corporate capacity, which is the most senior level of executive officers. And that's largely driven, in my opinion, by the divorce from Peterborough, which was brought about by the joint administration. So despite on 5.1 saying there are no significant implications within this category, which I agree with as an officer summation, it is what is contained in this report that I'm drawing attention to. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for that. Councillor Howard.
I think it's important to not mischaracterise what's happened here. This is a report about the formal agreement, so I think Councillor Count's contribution, whilst perfectly valid, probably doesn't affect the report before us. But since the joint administration came in, our approach has been and continues to be one of very constructive relations with Peterborough, and that will continue. And I think it's important to put that on record if there's any suggestion otherwise. The fact that mutually between Peterborough City Council and Cambridge County Council, we wanted to update, modernise and restructure some of those arrangements is perfectly proper in a democratic world, but that should not be characterised as anything other than mutual and cooperative between the authorities. In similar fashion, in our relationships with other neighbouring authorities, other authorities in our region and other like-minded authorities in the country, we have an open, outward and cooperative attitude to our work with other authorities. And I think the comments that I've just heard need to be put in that wider context. And I'll just give one example of that, which is our work together with Peterborough in relation to the integrated care system and the fact that we continue and intend to continue to have a joint public health function, for example, and to have very cooperative relations with our Peterborough colleagues in relation to health coordination and matters. And I would be concerned if that wasn't put on the record, given the contribution that was just made.
Thank you very much. Councillor Murphy.
Thank you very much. So I very much welcome this report and approach. It's really very wise and sensible, I think, to think through things like exit procedures before before the situation is upon us. Just a couple of questions, really. Reading through the so-called sovereignty arrangements, are they effectively there to avoid problems of agency? And separately, in terms of the key risks, what happens if something goes wrong with the shared service? How do we work out our respective liabilities?
Thank you. I'm slightly wondering whether that's one for you, Stephen. Tom first.
So what I would say on the sovereignty principle is what that ensured, I think, in principle, is that each council would retain its policy making discretion and that would make policy in its own right, and also they would have complete budget sovereignty, so to avoid any situation where there was any cross subsidisation between the two councils. So that was targeted. I think the purpose of the joint working agreement and the protocol are to deal with some of those liabilities that might arise. So, for instance, the finance protocol is quite clear on how costs should be split, the different methodologies that can be used for shared arrangements, and also where there are restructures or redundancy aspects, how those are dealt with. The other points, so there is of course some statutory risk in the services we provide, and the other protocols deal with those arrangements, and section 113 is about councils putting officers at the disposal of the other council without whilst those councils each themselves retain their own kind of statutory functions and responsibilities.
Thank you very much. Do you want to come in, Stephen? Thank you.
Just briefly, Chair, on the point that Councillor Murphy raises around liabilities, clearly we have some elements within the existing agreement that would cover those. I guess one of the things we're saying by bringing this paper to members today is, particularly from an exit protocols perspective, we need to tighten up some of those arrangements to make sure we manage them carefully. That is an active discussion that is still underway with the Chief Executive in Peterborough City Council, which is in part why the report is recommending a delegation to me to finalise some of those elements. Some of that pertains to the earlier discussion around separation of some of the existing shared services. But if I may say, Chair, I found myself somewhat surprised we didn't have those exit protocols built in at the point that Section 113 was first entered into to that level of detail, because of course both councils, as Councillor Murphy has rightly indicated, retained sovereignty both politically and legally, and therefore did have the option to move more into the shared service or take things out over time. The taking out appears not to have been fully catered for in the original agreement, so that's why we need to finalise that now, partly given the work we're doing, but also because it's good governance. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Murphy. I hope that answers your queries. Are there any other comments on this document? I don't see any further hands. So thank you very much indeed. I haven't heard anybody wanting to vote against that. So if anybody does wish to, could they indicate now? Otherwise, we'll take that as passed unanimously. And then we'll move to item 5, which is the Integrated Finance and Monitoring Report. And we'll move to Stephen. Welcome, Stephen.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Chair. This is the Integrated Finance Monitoring Report as at the end of October 2022. The IFMR is the summary management accounts for the council, consolidating the directorate FMRs that service committees receive. Members will see this time there are no attendant recommendations to this report to introduce. So instead, I'll briefly go over the headline information for you. So on the revenue side, the council continues to report a forecast overspend of around 0.6% or £2.7 million this time, which is similar in scale to previous reports to this committee. Despite low overall change, there are movements within individual services which have been looked at in more detail by the relevant committees and can be seen in the summary table in 2.1. In particular, the overspend remains substantially driven by the higher than expected local government pay award for this year. Increased pressures in some services are offset by underspend projected on the capital financing budget. Commentaries for the key variances for each service can be seen in Appendix 1, but on capital financing, I will say the projected underspend is predominantly linked to the council's relatively healthy cash position this year, which has negated some of the need for borrowing and is attracting interest in the bank as well. So that links to the Treasury Management report later on in the agenda. The key demand-led budgets, particularly within people services, are being closely monitored, particularly as we head into winter. Members can see the key activity summaries for those demand-led services in the tables within the text in section 1 in the intro, and commentaries as well in Appendix 1 for people services where there are some variances in the demand-led services that are being kept under close review. On capital spend, the council is projecting a forecast 5% or about £7.7 million net underspend against the net budget. Again, key variances are explained in this case in Appendix 2, and the increase in underspend projection between the last committee and this committee is predominantly due to phasing of spend within people services. So I'll leave the intro there. Thank you, Chair, if there's any questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Stephen. That was very excellent and introduction. Any questions on this report? Councillor Sharp.
Thank you, Chair. I've got 3 questions or points. The first one is, it's on page 28, it's on the table of the revenue budgets and the forecast outturn. Using my, spent a lot of time in central government finance, and we use something called run rates, and it's a very crude measure. Basically what you're doing is extrapolating the current spend to give you what you mathematically could be the outturn. You can then compare it to the forecast. I just obviously I know what the answer will be, but I just wondered how, in some cases, some of the services spend is running below that level, but obviously I know there's seasonal trends in there that would skew that very crude measure. I just wondered how robust we feel that is, and it might be a very unfair question. The second one is on page 37 in respect of the adult health. I'm just trying to, apologies. We're looking at a year-end target on, this is on debt outstanding, on adult social care. Target is just under 10 million. We're looking at an actual at the end of October of 12.9. I just wonder if that's more usage or whatever, but I'm just thinking in the current cost of living crisis, whether we've got a risk there in terms of collecting that. And the third one is on the numbers on the busway. We're saying that pre-COVID numbers the bus journeys haven't recovered to pre-COVID numbers. I just wondered, is that more commuters, or, because I'm aware certainly from my area on concessionary fares, we're still seeing probably less than 50% of concessionary fares uses compared to pre-COVID. So that demographic is still not comfortable going on the buses yet. So those are the three questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Sharp. Stephen.
So on the first question on run rate, it's definitely not an unfair question. Indeed, one of the points of including the actuals column in these tables is to give you that opportunity to try and triangulate how much is spent at the relevant portion of the year versus the forecast for those. And run rate in some services on the raw numbers is looking below if you extrapolate up where the forecast says it will be. The main driver for that will pretty much be that a lot of the services have grant funding from central government and other services and other parts of the public sector, which tends to come in lumps quite often this year towards the start of the year. So the income element will be depressing that. And, you know, for instance, with our pooled budgets with the NHS, we tend to bill in advance of a quarter's spend. So the income will be running ahead of expenditure in a given quarter there as well. But it is one of when we're looking through the forecast that we're working with services on, or that we are when we're reviewing forecasts submitted by services, triangulation against the run rate is one thing that we do look at on a monthly basis. On your second question, Councillor Sharp, on debt in adult social care, it is running, the total absolute level of debt is above that forecast indicator in there. It is obviously a risk, particularly heading into the cost of living crisis. And I think Audit and Accounts Committee certainly has been getting relatively regular updates on debt collection as well. There's several sort of changes that have happened recently, particularly moving towards a sort of a statement style billing of social care clients, which makes it much clearer what debt is owed by given people, I think is having a beneficial impact on the total level of debt. And there's quite closer working as well between the debt collection team and the adult social care service as well. So it's one to keep under review as you get these reports. But I don't think it's no bigger a risk today as it has been for the rest of the year, I don't think. On your third question on the busway and the driver of the access fees, I'm not sure of the precise answer in terms of whether it's commuters or anything else. I can get an answer to that from the relevant service for you. Thanks.
Come back very quickly. Thank you for that, Stephen. That's really helpful. It was just more trying to get an idea on the busway. It was trying to get an idea of where we are with the return, because as I say, certainly I know from when the stagecoach, sort of took certain routes away. I know the data that was cobbled together on my patch was that a lot of concessionary fare users were not returning to buses yet, and obviously it's trying to get them comfortable with going back onto buses. I just wondered, but thank you for that. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other comments from members of the committee? Councillor Count and then Councillor Bowden.
Yeah, just questions at the moment. So comments I'll come back to later on. So on page 43, there's a pressure in facilities management due to the continued cost of running the old Shire Hall site. I see business rates. What is the time for predicted time for full handover? And is that the same as was originally predicted? And if so, we knew rates were going to be in there. So can you give us some background information on what's going on with the whole Old Shire Hall site, please?
I'm going to come to Tom on that one. Thank you.
Thank you. So I can confirm to the committee that the council has now fully vacated that site. We successfully moved the registration service from Castle Lodge out to at the Asham Road in Cambridge, delivering that final part of the CAMS 2020 programme. In terms of the rest of the proposition at the Old Shire Hall site, we've been confronted by issues of both construction price inflation and challenges with yield rates, and we've seen that in government bonds, which are a proxy for these kind of long-term income strip deals. So those have presented some challenges, and we're at quite a sensitive stage of that transaction. We'll be able to give the committee some further information on that in the next few weeks, but we'd look to do that probably in private briefing before tackling that fully in public committee.
Chair, a little bit concerned here because, I mean, first of all, we've dropped committees from monthly to quarterly. So perhaps we may have been aware of this earlier on and been able to ask questions earlier on. But actually, if I hadn't have asked a question today, this doesn't look like it would have been flushed out. And there seems to be something much more than there's something going on that we're going to get a private briefing about. And that's by luck, coincidence or due diligence by us looking into the report. If we'd have received this report and a note saying, actually, there's something going on here, you will get a confidential briefing on it separate, that would have been more satisfactory than what's just occurred. So we're just left a little bit bewildered. Thank you.
If it's any reassurance, Councillor Count, this is something that I'm very well aware of, and I had a briefing on it last week. If you would like to have a briefing on it at any time, I'm quite sure that that Tom would be very willing to do that. I do think it's something that we need to be careful about discussing in a public session.
Thank you for clarity, Chairman. This goes back to a comment I made at one of our various earliest meetings. Are you telling us that you've been given information and it's been withheld from the opposition that holds scrutiny? You've just said you were made aware of this last week.
Absolutely not saying it's being withheld from the opposition. I've just said, if you would like to have any information on it, please feel free to ask the officers for that information. You are welcome to have any information that I have. I do not think it's ideal for us to be discussing that in public session.
Can I address the Chief Executive, please, and put on my concerns here? It seems that the only way we get information is when we discover it and ask for it, and that is now what's being offered. Can I point out that if there are briefings being made to the leader of the council, they should be made to the opposition as well, so that we can scrutinise what's going on. It shouldn't be a search and find mission for us.
Chair, thank you to Councillor Count for his comments. I'm very happy to pick up the specific briefing that he's referenced with him in one of my regular Conservative briefing meetings that I have usually on a weekly basis. So very happy to follow that up with the Service Director of Finance and Procurement and ensure you have the same information that the leader has received. Thank you.
Councillor Howard. Sorry, I think I'm going to Councillor Bowden next, and then I'll come back to you.
Thank you, Lucy. Councillor Count actually asked part of the question that I was going to ask, but the answer that was received was just threw up a whole host of additional questions. And all I can do at this stage is to read between the lines of the answer that was given by Tom and the comments that were made by you. And I have concerns based on that there is a potentially very significant issue here, not merely in terms of the current year's position, but also potentially future years as well. My first question is to you, is this potentially of such significance that we should discuss this here, but do so in exempt session? That's my first request to you. You know what the answer is, I don't. So that's my first request.
No, I don't think that is the case. I think what we've said is that you're very welcome to ask for information, but I would like you to ask for that information outside this public meeting. And if you would like to ask for that information immediately after this public meeting, that is completely fine. But I do not think that there's any need for it to be for us to go into private session to discuss any of this now. And I think it would be inappropriate for us to do that.
I can only rely, you know what we're talking about and I don't. So I've got to rely on what you say and that it's not appropriate for us to discuss this even in exempt session, which is fine.
Can I just say, that is not what I said.
I'm sorry, I didn't deliberately misquote you. Please correct me.
I suggested that if you wanted to ask for the information that I have received, you're welcome to have that as soon as you would like. It is not something that I feel is so significant that it needs to be dealt with by this committee in exempt session.
So I did understand that correctly. I apologize if I misspoke, but it's we have to rely, and I have to rely on what you say because you have the knowledge of what's involved. And if that is your conclusion, then I must accept what you say. But I wasn't contradicting anything that you were saying. We are told in Appendix B, Section 1.3, that in relation to this, and mostly we're talking about the expenditure is for NNDR, that there is a forecast overspend of £470,000. Am I to assume from that that we are saying that that overspend, which is mostly NNDR, is on an assumption that there is liability continuing up until the end of this financial year? And that's where the overspend is compared with a date which had previously been set in the budget process.
Go back to Stephen on that one.
That is my understanding, yes.
Thank you. And I was intrigued by the comment that progress is being made to reduce this. Well, I could see only two ways of making progress to reduce this on the basis that it is what has just been confirmed that it is. The first is to take the roof off Old Shire Hall to try and make it no longer susceptible to business rates, which may or may not be successful. The second is to try and reduce the time over which the liability continues to be predicted to exist. Am I correct in assuming that the progress being made to reduce this is in terms of the time element of the potential additional NNDR liability?
It's certainly not taking the roof off. So I think it's partly timing wise, partly I think we're trying to work with the city council as it is to see if there is any form of exemption or reduction that might be applicable to the now empty property.
That is very informative. Thank you. Very interesting. And my final question is, has any assumption, well, has an assumption been made so far in the budget setting process for next year? And apologies for talking about that, but it relates to the information we've got here. Has the assumption been made that no liability will leak into 2023-24 in relation to this, so far as the budget for next year is concerned, as it's been presented to us today?
You'll see the detailed budget paper is later, but I think there is no assumption about increased NNDR costs in next financial year at this stage.
Sorry, could I just get that clear? Is there no assumption made, or is there an assumption that there is no cost to be included?
There is no assumption about increased costs next year.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Howard next, I think, and then Councillor Goldsack.
Well, I do congratulate Steve Cope for at least laughing at that joke about the roof coming off Old Shire Hall. You know, this is the morning that the conspiracy papers about JFK have come out. So just not to add to the conspiracy theories, you know, the leader and deputy leader of this council take part in conversations all day, every day about the workings of this council. The fact that not every one of them appear on the agenda of this committee every time is just a plain fact of life. And what I hear is that when it's at the right time, we will have a report to this committee. But the democratic check, which is the opposition have the right to information in a timely way and in response to their questions, fine. We've heard about what the chief executive has said, and I hope those meetings go well. I'm sure they do. But there is also the spokes meeting where the leader of the opposition has every chance to raise these questions to the leader and deputy leader. So like the JFK issue, there's hours and hours and thousands of pages about these things, but nothing at the bottom of it.
Thank you, Councillor Howard. I don't think there was a question there. Councillor Goldsack.
Yeah, just a quick question on 2.2C, the energy projects thing. It mentions in there that the North Angle solar farm project will be energised, good use of words for a solar farm, by the 21st of, by June 23 and not December 23. So it's a 6-month delay, which it's saying here is due to the private wire. I'm a little bit confused by that because the private wire was an add-on to the original project. The private wire is solely in place to get through to Swaffham for that heat project there. So I don't understand why there's a 6-month delay due to an add-on to the original project. Have you got any explanation for that, please?
I'll come to Tom on that one.
Well, yeah, I can clarify that. So there is a section of the northern private wire connecting between North Angle and the grid, which is essential for selling energy to the grid. So the private wire is fundamental to it. What I would say is the council is very focused in our budget assumptions about, as everyone will know, the revenue generated is extremely seasonal. So it is vital for us that we get that connection by next summer. And a 6-month delay in the summer is much more problematic than a 6-month delay in the winter.
I'm not sure that answered the question, if I'm honest with you, Tom. I think the question was, the delay says here is the third party easements. I mean, look, we know that the landowners there were suddenly saw the council coming and said, I can make an absolute fortune here. Let's be blunt about it. Okay. But I don't understand the delay. The solar farm should have been operative by December this year and making the council money and therefore reducing the budget deficit. So I'm just interested, is the delay solely down to the negotiations over the easements? Is there some other reason? Is it to do with supporting the project at Swaffham, which needed support? Which is it?
Well, as I think I said to Councillor Goldsack in the first part of the answer, the private wire is an essential part of the critical path for generating this, for generating income from this asset. So those negotiations over the easements are important, and they have not, because they're difficult negotiations and they rely on multiple sets of lawyers, they haven't progressed as quickly as the council would have liked. I think we have seen some construction delay as well on the actual asset. It's not yet fully complete, but that is progressing well. But the critical issue at this stage is the connection of the private wire.
But I think the penny might have just dropped. So if I can just qualify that. So the private wire isn't the wire to Swaffham. The private wire you're referring to in here is the actual wire from North Angle across to Burwell, then on to Swaffham.
Yeah, it's being managed as one project to my knowledge, but it's obviously the section that connects it to into the grid, which is particularly important.
Thank you. Councillor Murphy.
Thank you very much. Councillor Sharp, picking up on a point that you made very helpfully earlier on. I've got a few questions, if that's all right. One is, there may be difficulty collecting income because of the cost of living crisis and the increasing costs that people and organisations are being exposed to. So my first question is, what is the overall risk to our budget of the cost of living crisis? The second is looking at Appendix B. There is page 7, looking at the central services and organisation-wide risks. I believe this is the area of our budget that includes insurance. So something that has come up in the Pensions Committee is the increased risk of pension scams, and they arise from a data breach. And the data breach is the liability of the IT system, which is the county's IT system. And I believe we are not insured, which is quite normal it's quite normal to not have been insured, but there is apparently an increased risk in this area. So it's a question of whether that is the right bit of the budget that deals with insurance, and whether this kind of insurance could be considered, because there are obviously pros and cons. And the third question, possibly for this section, but maybe possibly for the next item on the agenda, is what do you think is the impact of the, I gather, unexpected rise in interest rates? Do we think it will affect our inflation forecasts, for example?
Thank you, Stephen.
Your first question, Councillor Murphy, on what is the overall risk from the cost of living crisis? That's potentially quite a big question. I suppose in terms of debt, so on the income collection side, the council obviously collects tens of millions of pounds of income a year from residents. The vast majority of it successfully collected. There will be an increased risk from that, from the cost of living crisis you'd expect, and we'll take a view of when we're computing our bad debt provision towards the end of the year as to whether it needs to be adjusted on that basis. And as I said to Councillor Sharp's question, the debt recovery service is working very closely with the big income generating services, sort of increasingly closely and in an increasingly embedded way. And then obviously there is support from the council in terms of, the household support fund that we're running, etc., that is trying to mitigate the other end of the cost of living crisis, if you like. Your second question around that, so that central services and organizational risks line is a not very clearly titled line, but essentially is the budget line where we put the funding for the council's pay award pending that getting distributed down to services. So the pressure that is showing there is the higher than expected pay award. In terms of the specific insurance question you asked, the insurance budget sits on its own distinct line, and we have then the insurance fund on the balance sheet. The insurance fund is currently relatively well funded. If there's a specific question on that insurance aspect, then I could either pass over to Tom potentially, or we can answer it outside of the meeting. Your third question on the rise in interest rates. So we will cover this bit in the Treasury Management report as well, but rising interest rates will increase the cost of borrowing to the council generally. Most of that is picked up in the capital financing budget refresh that is in the budget papers for the medium term. Let's say we will budget for a higher average interest rate. A lot of some of the maturities we've got, particularly PWLB maturities that are coming up in the very near future, are at the 4 to 4.5% range because they were taken out quite a few years ago. So it's not a given that interest rates go up and therefore on a very linear basis our costs go up, because we've got older debt from the 90s in some cases, which were at quite a high level. We do take out quite a bit of year-to-year short-term market borrowing from other local authorities, which we've done very well at having low interest rates for a few years now, and we'll probably have to bear the cost of relatively high rates in that sort of short-term borrowing until interest rates settle and come back down a bit. But we will probably refresh borrowing as it matures from the short term with more short term rather than with PWLB. By and large, is that the interest rates on PWLB are still quite high. Sorry?
I appreciate the impact on the cost of borrowing, but my question was really, could this possibly affect our inflation forecasts?
Potentially, insofar as it will impact on the general inflation environment, the amount of the prices that are being charged to us by suppliers, etc., which will be factored into the detailed inflation projections that are done service by service, if that answers your question.
Thank you. I don't see any further questions. Councillor Count, I think you may have mentioned that you wanted to make a comment. So I'll come to that now, and then I might also make a comment.
I thought you started by saying you had two further questions, but yeah, we'll go on to the comments then. Thank you, Chair. I just need to move my page back to the appropriate. The one thing that concerns, or one of the things that concerns me throughout the IFMR is kind of the management, primarily in the capital schemes, about, and in the energy context, it's gone over budget, it's going to be late, but because electricity costs have gone up, we're going to get the money back. So that doesn't really matter. And it seems to me that that is an unacceptable way to approach this subject. You know, the actual increase in cost should be entirely recognised, and then the benefits, which are due to good luck in this case, should be separate elsewhere. And I think it takes the attention to detail off. But whilst we're talking about delays, there are an extraordinary amount of delays. And I think that whilst there are many justifications put forward and on an individual basis, I go back to the comments earlier about the staffing, the lack of staffing, and whether you've got enough people, enough qualified people able to maintain to actually run them. I mean, if I just take you to page 45, isolating a few of them. So Harry Smith Community College delayed, Camborne Village College delayed, Independent Living Service East Cambridgeshire delayed, which was actually give us benefits in running the council budget. It's delayed. Soham Primary expansion delayed. Moving on, St Philip's Primary, Alconbury Weald, LA Early Years Provision, delayed. Safety schemes, 997,000 out of 1.48 million, 2/3 of the budget going to go into next year. Delivering the transport strategy aims, highways, 742,000 out of 200 million, 2.5 million delay. St Ives local improvements, 3/4 of the budget delayed. Swaffham Pride Community Heat Scheme, we heard about that earlier on. Carriageway and footway maintenance, including cycle paths, which I'm sure you read about on your Twitter on a daily basis. £500,000 next year, not going to happen this year. B1050 at Shelford, not going to be started in the year it's predicted, going to be moved in next year. St Neots Future High Street Fund, Abraham Smart Energy Grid, Fordham Renewable Energy, 409,000 at 609,000 unspent this year when it's predicted to be, and bringing benefits to this budget. This is a catalogue of failure, not one, not two, not four, not seven. Right, something is going wrong, and you can't just keep presenting us reports on an individual basis saying, well, there's a bit of a problem here. There's something going wrong with the management of these projects, which is the responsibility of the joint administration to look into. The second point I'd like to raise is on the park and ride outturn variance, £600,000. The whole thing is written in a language that bus patronage has not recovered from COVID. I think you have to get your heads around the fact that bus patronage will not automatically recover to pre-COVID levels. The world has changed for various reasons. So people work from home a lot more. People stopped working a lot more. There are lots and lots of reasons. So I think instead of just saying, we're £600,000 this year and then building a budget for next year and future years that might be along the lines, you actually need to revise your thinking on that as to what will or won't happen. I noticed that in the public health grant, it's all allocated. The money comes in and it says it's all allocated, which makes it sound really good, but it's not allocated in the year that it is. And there's not an extreme likelihood that it'll be spent anyway. So I worry about the language about telling people everything's okay, we've got the money, we're spending it, when actually it's sitting around in reserves, not being spent on what it's intended, which is for public health. Just trying to run down the page slowly past all these ones that were late. I admire the bravery of the officers for highlighting the joint administration's advertising changes and the costing that will cause, the cost difference and the widening of the gap that will cause to this authority. I hope that line stays in the report in futures, because it is important to note that when the joint administration does widen the budget gap, that we have an honest reflection of that. So thank you to officers for that. I'll leave it there, Chair, but I do worry about the attention to detail that is going on from the joint administration in actually running the day-to-day running of this council.
Thank you for those comments. I don't know whether anybody else wants to respond to anything that Councillor Count has said. If not, then I will. Okay, thank you. So first of all, I absolutely reject that there's anything to reflect on a catalogue of failure here. I think that's incredibly unfair on our officers. I had, before you spoke, been going to speak about some of the bigger ticket issues in this report, and I think they're very important. And I think it's incredibly important to remember just how much has changed since this budget was originally set and since these goals were and some of the capital projects timescales were originally set. And the thing that I actually wanted to draw attention to initially was that there are some quite significant changes in here in relation to underspends in adult services and overspends in children's services. And I think that that particularly is a reflection of the fact that there was a huge amount of COVID uncertainty still built into this budget, and we were unclear, and we still remain a little unclear about what the impact of the huge changes that have occurred as a result of COVID to the way in which quite a lot of our social care costs change. So the pattern in this budget is that there are underspends in adult services and significant overspends in children's services and in home to school transport. And if you look across the whole of the local government picture, I think that that is something that is visible across a wide range of councils. It does indicate just how much we are still dealing with a very, very uncertain world and a world which has changed as a result of COVID. On top of all of that, this has been an extraordinary year in terms of the changes in costs, particularly in energy costs, and the knock-on effect that those have on construction and on other elements of our bills. And I have to say, I think it's absolutely extraordinary that we're looking at a variance of 0.6% and an overspend of 2.7 million, given the changes that there have been over the course of the year. That does not mean that those are things that we should be relaxed about. And as we go into this coming year's budget process, we're going to have to try and think about what the impact of the changes this year is on next year's budget. But I do think it's really important that we recognise just what an uncertain environment our officers are having to deal with in terms of all of the costs that they forecast at the beginning of one year changing by the beginning of another year. And I think it's very unfair on our officers to then say that that's a catalogue of failure on their part for not having managed to deal with all of that.
I object to that change of the language I used. I talked about the lack of oversight by the joint administration, the joint day-to-day running. I talked about the lack of staffing for officers. To try and change that into me criticising officers is very unjust, very unkind. But it is actually you trying to avoid the person I'm pointing at, Chair, the joint administration, your lack of oversight, your lack of management, your lack of resource provided.
That's an interesting comment, given that you were just complaining about us providing additional resource slightly earlier in the meeting. However, if you're making it very clear that you are not criticising officers, I welcome that. That's very helpful. Just to move a little further on, the other thing I wanted to comment on was the park and ride outturn variance and bus patronage. And I don't agree that I think we need to recognise that there is going to be a long-term change in bus patronage. Actually, my observation, and given that I live on the park and ride route, I see the buses every day. My observation is that while a couple of months ago the buses were quite empty, actually they're now full again. I don't know whether that will be reflected in the figures as they come through, but I think it will be interesting to see. Yes, Elisa, you can make a small comment.
Just a very
come to the end of this item.
Absolutely, no, just a very small comment. But I do think actually when it comes to notwithstanding everything that Lucy just said, with which I agree, but I don't think that the current situation with regard to capital slippage can be characterized as a catalogue of failures. Capital on our behalf, not that of officers. Capital slippage so far this year is lower than it's been in the last 5 years. So maybe we're doing something right.
Thank you. So I think we have been asked to note and comment on this report, and I think we have now done that. So we will move to the next item, unless there's anything more that we need to do on this, Michelle, but I don't think there is. Okay, thank you very much. The next item on the agenda is the business planning proposals for 2023 to 2028, and I will turn to Tom Kelly to introduce the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. This report records the progress with business planning in recent weeks, combining the updates that have been received at individual service committees this month. In terms of the council's assessment of the budget gap it faces next year, I'll take the committee to page 70 and 1.5 and 1.6. In October, we were reporting a budget gap next year of 28.6 million. And at the point that these documents were produced, the gap for next year most recently was £12.9 million. The committee, of course, will notice in those tables that the gaps in year 2 onwards remain extremely challenging. There's been various reasons for that progress in year 1, and they're set out on page 75 and at the table at 3.4. It represents significant endeavour and attention to business planning from CLT and right across the council in collaboration. The committee by now is very aware of the inflationary impact we've seen on our budgets this year, and combined with the complexity of demand, the impacts that we continue to see from the pandemic and the ambition of the council's policy agenda, it's required a rigorous review and iterative reconsideration of the budget as we search for additional efficiencies, additional income generation and reform. Throughout in this year's budget, the approach has been to prioritise the council's agreed policy agenda, which is a greener, fairer and more caring council. Since these reports were produced, there's been 2 developments the committee would expect me to highlight. Firstly, the Chancellor of Exchequer gave a statement during November. We're expecting the local government provisional finance settlement to come forward early next week. So at this stage, we're continuing to read down and from informal briefings of what the implications for Cambridgeshire are likely to be. The key headlines the committee will already know is that there has been some additional council tax flexibility announced for next year. Additional grant funds have been announced, quite targeted though, on the one hand at Household Support Fund continuing, and to a significant extent at social care. And alongside that, the postponement of the planned adult social care funding reforms, which will now have effect from autumn 2025, so 2 years later than planned. There are also significant changes announced on business rates that are quite consequential for the council, so greater subsidy for businesses paying those rates, and the way that business rates are then compensated and indexed is significant consequence for our budget. Taken together, if we'd had stopped there, those changes would have, I think, got us within a range where we can balance next year's budget. But a clear theme also comes through that although next year is looking more favourable as a result of the Chancellor's announcements, we do have a really challenging medium-term picture. And the impact of inflation, should it continue in the way that we currently see in forecast, is that we'll unfortunately continue to need to see very difficult budget considerations for the council. The second development alongside the Chancellor's statement is that we're continuing to see significant uncertainty in the budget and faster movements in our forecast than we're used to at this point in the year. So for instance, since we've produced these figures, we've seen adverse movements on electricity prices, on care pricing, and further pressures coming forward in waste management. So we are waiting with much anticipation on the results next week, and this committee will consider the budget again in January, where it considers all of those dynamics across new funding, the council tax proposals, further savings and efficiency, and the risk that the budget faces going into next year. Just a couple of other areas I wanted to mention in introduction. The capital budget is covered in this report, and we've seen significant reprioritisation in the budget this year. I attended CYP committee earlier this month where that was in full debate. And what the committee will notice is that currently for the second 3-year period under review, we are we do not have any capital borrowing headroom against our current limits, which would imply we will need to do further reconsideration and prioritisation if that remains the case in future years. At paragraph 5.3 of the report, we show for the first time the results of the triple bottom line assessment that has been considered for each of the proposals. That's a new development as part of this year's business planning cycle. And at paragraph 11, section 11 actually headed section 10 in places. We also note that the sustainable procurement strategy is attached to this business plan for the first time and lists the council's priorities in terms of how it will deploy these resources into the external expenditure that we procure, prioritising growth for local businesses, contributing to net zero targets, increasing the levels of social value, and delivering best value outcomes through procurement activity. So the first time in a number of years, I think we've had a sustainable procurement strategy proposed here in draft. So much hinges on next week, and we'll be back with a further update in January. Significant progress in recent weeks, but still a very challenging budget outlook to come.
Thank you very much, Tom. I'm going to come to Stephen, our Chief Executive, next.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of comments from me. Tom's referenced quite rightly next week being quite important. As members will see in paragraph 2.8, we reference the awaited full provisional local government finance settlement. The date for that being released continues to move around. The latest information we have is that we may receive the provisional settlement on Monday the 19th. Irrespective, I understand we have to receive it by no later than the 21st of December, because at that point, of course, government effectively goes into recess over the Christmas period. I also understand from commentary that I've picked up during conversations nationally yesterday that the usual debate on local government finance hasn't currently been scheduled in the House of Commons that would be happening around this time of year, which is not good news. More broadly, Chair, the thing I really wanted to highlight to members was that whilst we await the detailed settlement, earlier in the month, the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities published what they describe as a policy statement, giving some indications around the state of local government finances, not just for the coming 12 months, but for the following financial year as well. I think there's one key point that came out from that policy statement that I just feel is important for us to be aware of as a committee, and indeed for Cambridgeshire to recognise. And that was the very clear indication that was set out by central government that there will be no fair funding review for local government taking place during the period of this spending review. In effect, Chair, if you'll forgive the slightly colourful language, that means government are once again kicking the can on local government finance down the road to after the next general election, which is when the next spending review will take place. Obviously, I have some concerns about that from a perspective of Cambridgeshire. It's disappointing that government has chosen to do that, particularly since we are still operating as a council on the last spending needs that were updated based on information from 2013. Actually, that's in many cases drawn from data that goes as far back as 2001. Bearing in mind we had census results published for 2021, all I can say, Chair, is the lag in local government finance being updated and reviewed, particularly for a growing area like Cambridgeshire, is of huge concern to me, is of concern to officers, and continues to have a significant drag on our financial position. Dare I say, local government finance reform is going to be a challenge for whichever government chooses to undertake that, but it's necessary because Cambridgeshire and some other parts of the country are being unfairly penalised as a consequence of the current arrangements. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Councillor Bowden.
Thank you, Lucy. I think that the Chief Executive's comments just now have been very helpful. And I think that it is worth my saying that I agree wholeheartedly with the comments made by the Chief Executive. From Cambridgeshire's point of view, it is a great shame that yet again, it's hardly the first time, but yet again, we find that fair funding has been kicked down the road. And I think it was kicking the can down the road is an entirely appropriate phrase to use to describe what has happened. And one of the big problems which exist with this is that what we're talking about here is in fact a zero-sum game. What we're talking about is not merely redressing the losers in the process, which tend to be the areas which have had the highest level of population increase, of which Cambridgeshire is one of the greatest examples. But you also have to take into account the fact that there are winners from not going ahead with the fair funding review. And given that it is a zero-sum game, the problem is that the winners always applaud far less loudly than the losers complain. Now, that's not an excuse for it not happening, but sometime or other, and it has to be sooner rather than later as far as we're concerned, a government has to grasp this nettle and has to make changes.
Thank you, Councillor Bowden. That's very helpful. We might come back to that at the end. Any further comments? Councillors Wilson, Murphy, and then Hugh.
Thank you, Chair. Tom, could you clarify what assumptions you put in about inflation, and whether you've taken the Chancellor's optimistic predictions or the OBR's perhaps more realistic conservative predictions? And then what assumptions are there built in about charging and either savings that we might try and achieve by reducing our charges, or on the contrary, as we discussed yesterday at adults, increasing the charges to some self-funders? Thank you.
Yeah, I might ask Stephen Howarth to comment on some of the detail of this as well, but we certainly have close regard, and you'll see reference throughout the MTFS to the OBR estimates. Our inflationary assessment in this budget is built up, I think, across close to 100 separate indicators that are relevant to each service. So we take account of the contractual conditions we're subject to, whether there is a statutory regime around the level of inflation or uplift we're able to apply, which would often be the case in kind of client contribution charging that I think Councillor Wilson is referring to. And again, take account of different factors in relation to staff pay inflation, for instance. So we combine all of those individual indices, some of which will reference OBR or other indices like the building construction index, for instance, and use them to build up the inflationary budget. And Stephen, I don't know if you wanted to add anything else on those points.
I'll add one thing, which is to say that the national indicators like CPI underpin part of or all of a lot of those the indices that Tom talked about that build up the inflation projections. In this draft budget, the overall national estimates used are the ones that predate the autumn statement. The Chancellor confirmed in the autumn statement that the OBR projections for inflation next year were worse. So the next iteration of this draft budget will see a lot of the inflationary projections get slightly or a fair bit worse on top of the numbers in here.
Sorry, I misunderstood that. So when Stephen said they're going to get worse, does that mean the inflation figures in here are going to increase even more? So the deficit, not for next year, but for the year after in particular, is going to get even higher? And because I thought the Chancellor was saying inflation is going to drop back to more normal numbers, whatever they might be, and that's what we should be working on rather than a very large number. And I just wonder, particularly on things that Chris has said previously about scenario planning, how significant is this in the greater scheme of things? Thank you.
I think the Chancellor emphasised part of the overall inflation picture and said the other part of it quieter. So we are expecting inflation to drop back to normal levels, so the 2% target that the Bank of England has to try and maintain. But the length of time inflation will be relatively high, is expected to be longer, and the peak or the bit of that peak next year is expected to be higher than it was. So I think the Chancellor confirmed the projection is something like CPI will be about 7% in the middle of next year. I think we'd been assuming it would be down towards 5%, for instance, but we do still expect it over the course of the full 5 years to get eventually back down to 2%. In terms of sort of the scenario planning, the medium-term financial strategy element does say sort of what a 1 or 2% variance on inflation either way causes overall roughly in terms of the position. It can be quite significant, but bear in mind that inflation does affect the income we do receive as well, so it does have a bit of a dampening effect.
Thank you, Councillor Murphy.
Yes, thank you for clarifying what assumptions are are in this and as it were, what aren't. But equally, the impact of the interest rate rise may also have a downward pressure on inflation, which is presumably one of the reasons why it was brought in. But it was larger than expected, and so therefore we may see, I presume we may see further changes yet. Understand completely about the uncertainty. I must say it's an extraordinary situation we're in an extraordinary time. I welcome the sustainable procurement strategy draft that is in here. I'm very much in support. I have one small point, but it's not small to me. And that is in the triple bottom line, really, it's really good to see that this set out. I was a bit surprised to see Cambridgeshire Music as neutral on the social element, because to me that is very much as activities that promote employment, etc., as far as I had understood. So I just make that point. But otherwise, I think it's a really, really interesting effort to try to progress this way of thinking, even in the face of extraordinary political and economic times. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm hoping that the point about Cambridgeshire Music has been noted and that we can move on.
Well, it may be worth me just clarifying very briefly. What we're looking at there is the triple bottom line impact of any changes proposed. So the proposal in the business plan is that Cambridgeshire Music will make a greater contribution to the council's overheads and financial position. So it has a slightly favourable financial impact, but we're saying it will do that without any adverse or positive change in the outcomes it delivers socially for local people. So that's why the impact's neutral, because it will continue to do the excellent work it does on the points Councillor Murphy refers to.
So it's just that it's not that it's neutral, it's that it's not changing, which I think is important to reflect across our whole budget. Thank you. Richard.
It raises my heart that the social value of music is being discussed this morning. I didn't expect it. I just wonder what the office is going to give back to Cambridgeshire Music for their greater contribution. Perhaps you'll join more workplace choirs or something like that. In a week that we had councillor sing-song of Christmas carols, perhaps that's all entirely appropriate. Forgive me if on a more serious note, I address the issues that Tom raised in the report around adult social care. So the first thing to say about adult social care reform being delayed, we are a strategy committee as well as a resources committee, is that it's a dog's breakfast. So they've marched us up to the top of the hill. They're now sort of marching us down again, but we don't know. Even as late as yesterday, there's been the guidelines clarifying what's delayed and what isn't, haven't yet been published. Which is, of course, extremely difficult for our officers and our services then to be able to deal with. So we're still, for example, moving ahead with preparations for CQC inspection, perhaps in as soon as the first half of next year. And it does show the difficulties that we're dealing with. So I think that many people in the public would think that the reforms of adult social care have been delayed. And what they should know is that there's a great lack of clarity about that. And of course, in terms of the need for the reform, I know that won't be the major debate this morning, but in terms of the need for reform, a delay is fine if something happens in the meantime to improve the proposals, but all it is yet again kicking the can beyond the general election. And so this is entirely unsatisfactory from all points of view. So that's a policy comment. A resources comment is this. So we've gone through the so-called fair cost of care exercise, as have every county council and every social services authority in the country. So-called fair cost of care because it's nothing about fairness, but it is about cost. And the expectations have been raised with our providers that they'll get more money. And the government is now, we think, going to give less money than expected, which is going to cause difficulties between us as an authority and our own providers, which for entirely of the government's making. And I'm not sure how far providers are watching and listening to this debate, but to the degree that messages that we say do count out there, I do pledge on behalf of our authority that we will passport as much money as we can in the share as a share of the money we do receive from government when we know what it is to them. And you know, that's the best we can say, but we do say it. Thirdly, on this issue of grants, and I heard what Councillor Count said earlier about getting grants and then sitting on them. I don't live in the same world. I really don't. There were 4 councillors in this room from all 3 groups yesterday in a meeting where we heard from a primary care network that they'd been invited to apply for a grant and they had a 6-hour deadline to do so. Right, this is a world in which the government is giving the shortest of short-term grants. It is absolutely crazy, and I think we need to, certainly in the field of the committee that I chair, we need to protest about that. And to his credit, Councillor Bowden has said that as well. On the capital programme slippage, Stephen, and difficulties and constraint, you know, I fully accept what was said. But I remain worried about the independent living schemes. They have slipped. It's financially, it's completely counterproductive for us to let them slip because we're going to end up with elderly people going into more costly residential care. So it's building up the problem in the medium term, but not just a financial problem, a human problem. We've got more and more elderly people who need more appropriate housing, and it's not there. And we've made a pledge as an administration to build it. And I hope somehow, as I fully accept prioritisation needs to take place, that the work on the independent living schemes is going to continue. I think I've got one more point, Chair, so I need to go to my, no, 2 more points. I just say to Tom Kelly, excellent report as ever, and huge respect for the way the budget process is operating. But when you talk about the national living wage properly in the report, this administration's priority is for the real living wage. And I want to see as much in our reports about that. And it's a bit more, but it's a bit more that pays itself back in terms of social value, better recruitment and retention. And in the end, we're going to be better than other councils by the policies that we work on the real living wage. But I know that it's set at different times in the year, and that's probably the reason you didn't put it in the report this time. But I really think that we need to do that. And finally, I don't want an answer today, but when the budget is presented, I really want us to hear what we're not doing because of triple bottom line that we would have done if it was just a finance only report, and what we are doing because of triple bottom line that we wouldn't have been doing if it's only a finance report. And if we can't answer that question, it's not triple bottom line. And I fully accept we can only do it on investment this year, and it's a step-by-step approach. I think that's fine. But we have to show this isn't just presentation. This is actually about different decision making. So I'm just reminding Tom of my fervour and enthusiasm for that point when we get to the budget setting process finalisation. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Councillor Sharp.
Thank you, Chair. I've got sort of 2 questions and one, well, comment or whatever. The first one is on 1.16, and we mentioned the cancellation or change, whatever we want to call it, by the government in terms of the national insurance uplift. So it mentions there that's obviously reduced our budget costs. On 2.7, it then mentions that we were funded for that by government. So I'm assuming the reduction in funding is included in there, so it's a net nil on the budget. The second one is partly touching on Councillor Wilson's question in terms of inflation. Certainly from Highways and Transport Committee, we're being told by officers that building costs and tarmac and everything else is running at a much, 30%, I think is the figure that's being quoted. So I just wondered what we've built into there for inflation. And the third point is, looking at the paper, we've obviously taken out the vacancy I'll say it's not cost, but obviously where we don't get 100% employment, then we're getting an underspend, which and it's I've not got no issue with the way it's going to be done in the future, because you either program for it or budget for it, or else you show it as an underspend against the actuals. All that I would ask going forward is whether it be by note that certainly the committees I'm on, we have a note of, shall we say, that the full establishment of those departments, and then we have what the vacancy is running at, because that way I think it gives us a much clearer picture as to how we are going forward. So those are my questions and points. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think Stephen wanted to come back on the first one. Was I right about that? But I'm happy to go to. No, sorry, apologies. In that case, Tom or Stephen, who wants to pick those up? Tom.
Well, I'll take the easy one. So the impact of the national insurance changes, which were funded through grant, and that grant we're expecting to be reversed, so that will have a neutral impact. So highways, we have revisited a couple of times the inflationary allocation. So that is an example of the indices we referred to earlier in the model that we build up, having particular regard there, I think, to the BCIS index, which kind of flows through to our contractual arrangements with the contractor. I couldn't tell you what the exact figure for the allocation is, but we're happy that it's appropriate in that context. Does that deal with your? Was there a further question, Councillor Sharp?
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, I'm sure going back on the highways and transport, I'm sure you would have included it, but I felt it was right to ask the question. Now, the third one was more a comment about the vacancy factor, which, as I said, I accept the way it's being dealt with here. I haven't got an issue with that, but I think for visibility from, perhaps it's the accountant in me that likes it, but I would like to see personally, even if it's by note or it's something I ask officers as a question, that the full establishment cost and then the vacancy savings that we're making. That was all. That's going forward.
Yeah. So as part of the detailed budget build we do, after members have approved the budget, we then ask each individual budget holder to complete a budget build ahead of the start of next year, and that includes accounting for both field posts and vacancies. So that gives us a really comprehensive picture at that point of the level of vacancy on a kind of team by team basis. So we will be able to summarise that and share it as a note, probably in I'd expect late February time, early March, perhaps, with members.
Thank you. I hope that covers your point, Councillor Sharp. Good. Thank you very much. I don't see Councillor Count.
Yeah, can I start off with a question and I'll move on to comments later. So I just want to help in understanding how the tables are written, but I've seen them many times before, but I just want to confirm what I'm saying. So the table I'm specifically referring to, if we can go to that page 101, please, Tom, Stephen. So if I take a figure like archives, £377,000 for archives, their net budget 22-23 was £377,000. The net budget and all the opening budget for all the future years are £376,000. So pretty much flat. How is the inflation element handled? So it's roughly 11%, shall we say? How is that handled if we're 376,000 and 376,000 next year? How's the inflation element handled?
So it's a very useful question, I think, from Councillor Count, and it enables us to highlight how we've treated staff pay inflation. So for a budget like archives, the predominant impact is on staff pay. The assumptions I think we've made at the moment around staff pay around 4.5% uplift next year is our assumption, and 3.5% on average for subsequent years. Because those are very much assumptions at the moment, we haven't yet applied those to individual budget lines. They're held centrally. Certainly my aspiration would be that we do allocate that out on a kind of line by line basis in time for the final budget you receive. So I suppose what that's reflecting at the moment is that we're not envisaging any kind of changes in those budgets, in that budget, that you can see flat as a result of an investment or in disinvestment, but the actual application of inflation that's held centrally still needs to be done.
Thank you. So this is primarily staff. The staff inflation element is taken out. So some of this is not staff. So staplers, envelopes. What about building maintenance? What about actually display cabinets that wear and tear? What else is there in an archives budget then that isn't staff? That must form something.
Yes, so I think they're probably quite a significant element of the council's budget, even in the inflationary context we're seeing. So those kind of sundry items, we would probably apply a 0% inflation as a kind of an efficiency factor. So that's probably why you're seeing that static effect. I think this budget will very much be dominated by staffing costs and some element of income, which you can see there in the gross line. But we can have a further, more detailed look at that if Councillor Count would welcome it.
Yeah, thank you. So I picked archives because I was aware of the just the amount of staffing costs are in there. But actually, this is pretty much the same principle used to every single line in the budget. So if I take public library services, yes, there is a lot of staff in there, but there is also things like we buy books. We buy books, and next year they're going to cost 11% more. There might be an individual inflation factor in library services, but so we're going to buy 11% less books. And from the figures we heard earlier, we're going to buy 5% less the year after, in real terms, 3% the year after that. So by the end of 5 years, we're actually going to buy somewhere in the region of 23% books. Same goes for Think Communities, Youth and Community Services. Everywhere there is a flat line, any non-staffing item, they just have to soak up and put up with it. Now, I understand that we've run that sort of thing in the past when inflation was 1.5%. So it was almost negligible and you could find somehow the efficiencies in the service. But I don't understand when you're talking about close on to 25% over 5 years, presenting budgets in this way, why you wouldn't have community impact statements and actually bring these things to light. If we look at not included in our tables of the budget, but going through highways, local highways improvement have been slashed by 12% in real terms for next year. But it's not acknowledged or recognised by the administration or described as such, because the actual inflation figure is worked to in highways is 13%, but the actual increase in the budget is 1%. So that is a real terms cut of 12%. So I've seen the press releases, I've seen how the direction of travel is going, but why isn't there an acknowledgement from the joint administration about the sheer quantum of cuts that are going on? And actually, why aren't there community impact statements when they're identified as being non-staffing because they're simply at surplus to that budget?
Can I just ask for some clarity on what's just been suggested? Tom, I think when you were talking about inflation at the beginning, were you meaning that only staff pay is held centrally, or that broadly inflation is held centrally?
Stephen, do you want to comment on this? And then I do want to just draw attention to a couple of other things, but on where we've held inflation in this iteration.
Yep. So in the held inflation, I think exclusively is staff pay. Other aspect of service costs, such as building maintenance, etc., sits on its. There is a separate property budget line that deals with the costs of the council's buildings. Taking the public library service, for example, looking at that, it isn't flat cash between 22-23 and 23-24. The thing to bear, the predominant cost to the public library service is staff still. It's worth bearing in mind also that the public library service generates income which will have been inflated. So there'll be an element of income inflation within that budget line offsetting spend inflation on potentially on books or the sundry costs of running a library service.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
So the couple of things I wanted to add was that to emphasize, first of all, that we provide, and we're very clear that we're providing a detailed budget for next year and then outline plans across the rest of the MTFS cycle. The committee will see on page 103 that we have across that period prioritised new investments into libraries to serve new developments, which would imply a kind of an expansion of the library service. And then I think Councillor Count is right in the sense that the macroeconomic picture and what flows down from the announcements we've had so far is that in real terms, the council's spending power at the moment, in 5 years' time, will be less than it currently is, and that is a challenge we are going to have to confront over the coming years.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Tom. And perhaps we could acknowledge that in some of the press releases that go out, instead of exonerating everything, that there is a lot of shrinking and cutting going on. I want to go on to some of the other areas. So I'm away from questions now, if I may, onto comments, Chair. I want to draw attention to the minimum real living wage comments, and these are contained 2.7, page 74. The minimum wage is being increased to £10.42, which has an additional cost to the council of 1.5 million, may go up to £2 million with the other bits. The council committed to the real living wage for its direct employees, and also, I believe, in children's social services contracts, but not in adult social services, or was it the other way around? That was in the paper that went to SNR earlier this year. So whilst it's this impact, I understand it, is the cost of the areas of real living wage that this council hasn't committed to, which was part of their joint administration pact. I'm disappointed to read yet again about on 6.4.9, page 80, a saving proposed within the Strategy and Partnerships Directorate. It's about the communities team, and under SNR, but under the remit of another committee, which, let's face it, it's your decentralisation. So almost 2 years in, savings promised, and not a single piece of detail in there, as acknowledged in the report. It's something we're working on. I'm quite glad that Councillor Howitt picked up on the independent living services, which I mentioned earlier, and thank you for waking up to what I've drawn attention to, because it does reinforce what I was saying about the delays in delivery means the delay in funding, and that's absolutely right. And I welcome the fact that now you're actually questioning officers and highlighting it, and I hope that you'll take personal responsibility into trying to drive this through, as I asked for various of the other areas that are going on. And other delays don't just cost money in terms of funding, but with this level of inflation, if you delay a capital project, it is undoubtedly true that the costs of that capital project are likely to go up. I'm a little bit worried about the reserves being held. We know that you moved the general purposes reserve from 3% to 4% last year, but you have so many other non-committed reserves. It's quite staggering, really. And I just feel like, so just drawing your attention to that, if you haven't got that, it's on the secondary document. So it's on page 171. We retain substantial other reserves that, while earmarked, are not necessarily committed to expenditure. It really does defeat the word earmarked to say that they are just earmarked when they're not. So if you have a just transition fund, I don't really call that an earmarked reserve. That is a separate reserve. But to have earmarked reserves and normally have specific results attributable to them. I was asked in Tuesday about what the Conservatives have done to reduce public transport, and I gave a very long list that was quite embarrassing, I think, seeing as it was claimed it was none. But I want to drag your attention to another one here on page 188, and I compliment the team that continues to work on rolling out of the Connecting Cambridgeshire programme. It's now 98.5% of premises have a broad super fast access to broadband, and the figures were we accessed £42 million of commitment, including funding from the County Council under the Conservatives auspices, and I congratulate you, because at the end of the day, this county was well prepared in terms, compared to other rural counties, in terms of superfast coverage when the unpredicted COVID happened. And the benefits of that still go on today in reducing the need for public transport, as people are simply able to work remotely, which has been a blessing for many. I'm concerned on page 209 about the free wave school money that you secured for Wisbech. You deleted it from the capital programme because it was going to be delivered, and I'm starting to think in terms of years rather than months when you did that, and the promises that were made to Fenland that you're going to build that under the DFT, and it was all underway, and yet there's nothing in here about this moving forward, but at least it's acknowledged that it's still in there. Just picking up on the Cambridge Music social elements, totally agree. The benefits of music cannot be understated. I'm glad that we've got Cambridge Music into a position where they're not a net drain. I'd love to hear more on the subject if it starts any outreach work further afield, because I was always dismayed that the most needy in our society, primarily Fenland, had no access to Cambridge Music, and there was no outreach program to them. Hopefully that's changed, and hopefully that's a priority for this joint administration. I'm just unaware if it has moved forward on that particular one. On the fair funding review, going back to the Chief Exec's remarks, I totally agree with everything. I support Cambridgeshire County Council pushing for a fair funding review moving forward. During the entire 7 years that I was leader, it was something we always promoted. That was under a Conservative government and under a Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition. Before that, it was Labour. It has been going on far too long. We have new census evidence that backs us up at the moment. So I'm perfectly willing as a Conservative to call for a fair funding review. We did have some success under the when Rishi Sunak was Chancellor primarily, because we actually managed to get there were two elements of the fair funding that were that Cambridgeshire was tragically undercompensated for as a council. One was geographically as the nature of Cambridgeshire. The second was an upper tier authority, and all upper tier authorities did tend to get a rebalancing act to the tune of about £70 million a year, I think, which helped address some of those inequalities, and those are now baked in. So whilst the fair funding review hasn't been dealt with as a fair funding review, there has been elements of funding coming through a side door, so to speak, that help with some of those issues. But I continue to agree with anybody that says the funding for Cambridgeshire, not just for this county council, but for our health, for our fire, for our police, for all our services, is tragically unequal. And I understand why governments of all hues duck it, because the moment you want to give more to one when you don't have pockets that are just overflowing and you're as rich as Croesus, means you have to take away from somebody else, and that is always going to be difficult, but that bullet has got to be bit. So thank you for that, Chair.
Thank you. Are there any other comments? Councillor Criswell.
Thank you, Lucy. It'd be remiss of me not to just mention some concerns in the communities area. Under the intended investor save benefits of place-based working, the Think Communities team was specifically designed to be self-funding, and the continued delay in decentralisation, I think kicking down the can down the road seems to be the in phrase this morning, has now put that Think Communities budget under pressure. And I'm just concerned about some of the savings that are being considered, withdrawing our contribution to the scams partnership, for example, just at a time where regrettably scams are prevalent. I understand the conversation hasn't happened yet with the other members of the partnership, so I would have hoped that would have happened before it was put in the budget as a potential saving. And of particular regret to me is the withdrawal of the Cultivate Fund. It's been very successful since its inception in 2016. The 2.3 million pound investment that we've put into that over the last few years has yielded around a £1 million benefit on top of returning the 2.3 million, and have been of huge benefit to communities in building resilience on top of that. So it's all very well removing investor save projects from the bottom line of the revenue budget, but of course we forego the benefits and the savings that they make. So not very happy to see those savings being brought forward. And if we stop investor save projects, then it has a wider effect than just removing that from the budget. So just want to flag up those concerns. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Hoy.
Yeah, just on the Wisbech point that Councillor Count made, I don't disagree. The school is still not built. And what happened, I still feel is absolutely shameful, to be honest, to go to committee and remove it from the capital programme because the government said they were funding it. That wasn't a new thing. That had been the case for a significant amount of time, and it had always been in there as a backup. And it was removed to make savings, no other reason than that. And people weren't honest about that. They were trying to say it was for various other reasons, and it was for nothing other than to make savings. That school has not been built. The decisions on that committee were made, I think, still technically not completely within the law, because we had a situation where cooperative members were not allowed to vote, and there was some challenge over whether they could vote or not. And despite me asking the monitoring officer for a review of those decisions, a review of those decisions has never taken place. So I would like to ask the Chief Executive to please review those decisions that happened before the rules were changed, because I feel I genuinely feel that our town was robbed of that school. There's not a brick been laid. The school is supposed to be open now, and we have no school. And we sat there, and again, it's just like people just don't care about Fen. And we sat in a Children and Young People Committee talking about the business plan last week, and we had a discussion for the best part of an hour over a potential cut of a classroom extension in Cambridge City, which wasn't actually for basic need. It was to create space. Admittedly, a good project, I don't doubt that, but we had an hour, we had members talking about that, and although they voted to cut it, they were very uncomfortable, it had to be said. But when it came to Mainey, it was completely glossed over. So the Joint Administration have decided to make cuts to the planned expansion of Mainey Primary School, didn't even tell the local member until the local member found out through me texting them in the committee and saying, do you know what's going on? So it's just time after time, anything happens in Cambridge, everyone's nervous. Anything happens in Fenland, you just don't care and you just make the cuts. And I just think it's absolutely shameful.
Thank you. I don't see any other hands, so I'm going to make a couple of comments, and I do want to come back very quickly on what's just been said about Cambridge versus Fenland. I want to make it absolutely clear that we care just as much about what happens in Fenland as we do about any other part of the county. And schools need to be built where there is a need for a school and a population need for a school. We do not have the capital budget to go around building schools if there is not a population need for that school. If there is a population need, of course the school is built, and that's what the decision is based on, not on to do with where it might be in the county. And I think it's, I want to be absolutely clear that our officers would not allow anything different to happen, and any suggestion that should be the case is absolutely refuted. So,
Chair, point of order, Chair, the Wisbech School, there is basic need. The paper's very clear there's basic need. So to suggest there isn't basic need is not right.
I'm not convinced that is the case, but I'm not convinced that there is a demonstrated need for the level of requirement that was expected some years ago. On the other points that I wanted to make, and I've got quite a few of them actually, I want to go right back to the beginning of our debate to start with, and talk about a little bit about adult social care reform and the delay to that, which is a significant factor in our budget. But I want to be really clear that although the delay to that reform may be welcomed by some in local government finance, actually from a complete fairness point of view, I do not welcome the delay to that reform, because there was a reason why that reform was urgently needed. And that is that at the moment we have a system which is incredibly unfair on families who have a family member who needs very, very long-term care. And it is an absolutely shocking and outrageous situation where if you have a family member who suffers from dementia, for example, you may end up having almost the entire savings of that person eaten up with care costs. And that should not be the case. Politicians from across the political spectrum have agreed for years that that should not be the case. And yet we are still failing to tackle that problem. And the situation with self-funders subsidising the costs of care of those who are not self-funders is deeply unfair. And while from a council point of view, the delay is helpful because the introduction of it would have been very difficult. From a social fairness point of view, it's a disgrace. And I think we need to be clear about that. The other thing I want to talk about is, well, actually, I'm going to just go back briefly to music in Fenland. And there was a suggestion that was made by Councillor Count that Cambridgeshire Music does not offer services in Fenland. I don't believe that that is true, but I think we need to check on that, and we will make sure that something comes out to members to indicate whether or not that is the case. If Councillor Count is right, that is certainly something that needs to be tackled, but I don't believe it is. Fair funding. I think this is something that this council has talked about for as long as I have been on it. And in the 12, 13, 14 years since I've been a councillor, 13 and a half, I think, the situation with fair funding has got very little better, and the impact on this council, because it is one of the highest growth areas in the country, has got worse and worse. And I think, again, this is something that it's really important that there is unity in this council in saying how unfair that is to Cambridgeshire residents. I'm really pleased that there has been unity about that in this meeting. And I think it would be helpful if we were to gather some information about what the current impact of that failure to recognise our level of growth is. So what I think what I might take as an action, please, is to get a letter drawn up, drawing attention to the impact of that on our area. And potentially then we can send that to the Secretary of State to draw his attention to it, to the impact of that failure to recognise that level of growth is having on services in this area. And if that were able to be signed by all parties, that would be really helpful. So we'll have to get the letter drawn up. I'm not going to ask you right now whether you'll sign up to that, because you'll need to see the letter before you agree. But I think it would be really helpful to be able to get cross-party view on the impact that that's having on our area, because it's something that's been going on for a very, very long time. The final thing I want to say is that I actually welcome the discussion that there's been at this meeting about the impact that inflation is going to have on our services, and the really tight and difficult situation that puts our the people who lead our services in trying to deliver the same for less year after year after year. And while that is pretty much what is in this budget, I think it is something that we as a council need to look at quite carefully and think about what we are delivering and how we can deliver it better. But I think it's quite difficult to do that before this budget goes through, but it's certainly something we are going to need to look at really carefully in the coming year, because it is not simply possible to carry on doing the same for less all the time. Actually, there is one final point I want to make, which is on the Think Communities team. I think we do all value what that team has done. There was never long-term funding available for that team. And I think that the thing that is being attempted in this budget is to put that team on a long-term secure basis. If after the budget information comes out on the 21st or possibly even the 19th, there is some money available for further investment in something similar but not the same as the Cultivate Fund. That's something I would really like to see, but I do not want it to be the same as the Cultivate Fund, because I think there were problems about the way in which that was originally set up. So it would need to be something similar but not the same. And I think we have had to deal with some of those problems for some time in the Cosmic Committee, and I know that Councillor Criswell is aware of that. Good. I think we have quite a lot of noting to do on this report. So we note the progress made to date and the next steps required to develop the business plan. We note the budget and savings proposals. We note the changes to the capital programme that are within the remit of the committee as part of the consideration of the council's overall business plan. We review and comment on the strategic framework. We note the draft medium-term financial strategy and the capital strategy and the sustainable procurement strategy. So all of those things I think are for noting. The final bit, which is to agree the proposed capital financing limits for 2023 to 2028. So I hope that everybody present is happy to say that we have noted and commented and that we can agree the capital financing limits. Is there anybody who is not happy to agree those recommendations? I see no hands, so I hope that that can be taken as unanimous. Thank you very much on that item. And we will move on to the corporate performance report, item 7. Tom, thank you.
So thank you, Chair. This is a corporate performance report for the second quarter of 2022-23, and it also notes progress against the joint agreement actions that have been transferred to this committee's oversight. Just to highlight, out of the 19 corporate service KPIs, 27% are 7, so 27% are on or above target, while 7 are below target. 2 KPIs are off target by more than 10%. This is 1 less than Q1 version of the report. These are related to KPI indicator 169, so contract waivers submitted less than 5 days before their proposed start date, which is collated by the Council's Commercial and Procurement Service, and I'm joined by Claire Ellis, who will be able to offer additional commentary on that. And then K indicator 183, the proportion of subject access requests responded within the statutory timescale, which relates to and is collated by the Council's Information Governance Service. And I'm joined by Ben Stevenson, who will also be able to offer additional commentary around that. Happy to answer any questions. There's further commentary within the appendices of the report as well.
Thank you very much, Tom, and to the team for being here too. It's nice to see you. Councillor Bowden.
Thank you very much indeed, Lucy. Right, 2 points. The first, a very simple one, and it's a request both for this committee and also elsewhere. For example, I've raised it previously in audit and accounts. Where we have a performance report where a number of indicators are given to us in RAG-rated format, could we please order them so that all the red RAG-rated items come first in the report and others come later? It actually helps to highlight the things which are red RAG-rated if they are first in the report rather than spread randomly throughout the report. But the first item on the report was red RAG-rated, and that is the performance indicator 169, which has just been mentioned. It's another one which I have raised at audit and accounts, and that is the percentage of contract waivers submitted fewer than 5 days before their proposed start date. And the reason this exists is because we should be very cautious about any waivers which take place of our procurement process. And where those waivers take place at such short notice that effectively they have to go through in order for a service to continue, it's a very worrying sign. Now, in practical terms, even in the best run organizations, there will be occasions when something happens at very short notice and you do end up having to have a waiver granted, a procurement waiver granted at very short notice. That just happens. And that's accepted within the target that we've got here, where we have a target of it should be a maximum rather than a target of 20% of waivers which are granted fewer than 5 days before a contract is due to start. The actual figure that we've got for our last quarter here is 76% rather than 20%. Now, as I say, some things are unavoidable, but one of the reasons for having this particular KPI is to act as it's a form of feedback loop, where by identifying where there has been a failure to seek a waiver in plenty of time for the normal process to be gone through, it's possible to make sure that those individuals who have failed to do that understand the problem, understand their failure, and are able in future to make sure that that doesn't happen again. To get to a figure of 76%, and it's a rising trend, it hasn't got much further, it can rise, of course, beyond 76%, but to get to that position suggests that we have individuals within our organisation who still haven't caught on to what is required when it comes to procurement and seeking waivers. Now, what I did suggest at Audit and Accounts, and I'm going to suggest it here as well, if you don't mind, Chair, is that the Chief Executive takes responsibility for looking at these occurrences. We don't see them all. Three are mentioned here, which are over 100,000, but clearly there are more which are between 25,000 and 100,000, which we don't get details of. And I think that because there's a process involved here, I think having the Chief Executive as part of the process to review these occurrences where contract waivers take place 2 of them 5 days before a contract is due to start, having the Chief Executive as an integral part of that, not within the process, not before the contract is signed, but reviewing it afterwards to make sure that first of all that it's proper and that lessons have been learned and the necessary feedback has taken place. I think that would now be helpful because clearly the feedback loop hasn't worked. We wouldn't have this 76% in front of us if the feedback loop had worked. So I'm not asking for the process to be in any way threatened by the Chief Executive having to give a sign off before a contract is signed, but I think that every one of these should be looked at by the Chief Exec, A, to ensure that there's nothing which is improper which has gone on in the way in which something has happened, which I'm quite confident will be the case, but B, to make sure that the learning has taken place because that's what appears not to be taking place at the moment. Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you. I think there's a lot in there and that I agree with. I'm just going to come back to Stephen about whether you think that's a good idea or not, because I think it would be an awful lot of work for you potentially to have to do. But
Chair, thank you. I think Councillor Bowden's suggestion is a helpful one. What I'd probably want to do as an action is discuss that with the head of procurement and commercial following today's meeting rather than committing here in the meeting. So let's have a look at the volumes and the impact that that would have. Nonetheless, for my sins, I used to have to sign off every single waiver for the City of Edinburgh Council in my previous role. So even where other executive directors had delegated authority, they had to go through a countersign and check by me in my previous role. So it's not something I would necessarily see having to do as Chief Executive. It may be something for the Section 151 officer to take forward in the future. I'll discuss it with the head of procurement and commercial, and we'll come back to members with an update outside the meeting. But I think the suggestion is a helpful one. So thank Councillor Bowden.
thank you, Stephen. And I hope that that does also give some reassurance that in the sense that this is an important thing and it's not getting any better, we take that seriously. Councillor Goldsack.
Thank you, Chairman. There are 2 points completely unrelated. One is indicator 171, the rent per acre obtained from the agricultural estate. I did raise this at the pre-meet. I'm pleased to see that an improvement, and I know the work that the Farms Estate have done, particularly last year on looking at rents and rent attainable. But I'm a little bit confused by the metric where the target of 103, a current year of 144 over previous year of 133 and a blue rating. Well, it would be blue if that target is so far out compared to the actual. So do you want the second point as well, Chair, now? All right. The second point is on one that comes to this committee, which is number F9, the new project management framework and strategic program management office. We've been talking about this for really quite some while now. Officer Amanda Askin, no longer with us, had a PMO in place. What I would ask is for an actual update as to where we're at on this, because I find the metric on here should have been done by September. Is it done? Have we got a strategic program management office in place now? And B, my experience of PMOs, whatever type we want to give them, is there's a fantastic ability to get a dashboard report out showing project current status, projects current stage. That's the project portfolio. I think it would be a really, really useful thing for this committee to see that. And I would actually, I think it's Sue, I would actually ask Sue at the earliest opportunity that this committee could actually see that, to get a view of how the SPMO is working and actually see the output that's available from such an entity as a PMO.
Thank you. Do you want to comment on that, Tom?
So yes, on the indicator around farm rentals, the target itself is a benchmark against the East of England as a whole. The last time that data came out was in February of this year. The data for the next available release will be in the gov.uk says it's in January. So we'll be looking at updating the target with the next release of that data, and then the update of the indicator within the Q3 version of this report. We'll also engage with the service themselves around whether that is still an appropriate, target, really.
Yeah, thank you. And that's a really good answer. Thank you very much for that. My understanding, and it does say something of this in the text, but my knowledge of this also is that there's quite a variance between the way that the East of England set that target as opposed to us, i.e. I think that's per arable acre, whereas I think ours is including all the buildings, the houses, and everything that goes with it. And I think there's quite a bit different there. So I question the actual use of it as the target, because I think it's the reason I raise this is I just think, you know, we're what, 45-50% variance on that. So if we're 45-50% variance, that's probably not great. Even though it's blue, it's probably not great. So we might want to rethink that.
Councillor Count, I think you want to comment on the same.
Just on that point, yeah, I hadn't picked up on this, but can we also look in at the same time at the benchmarking? If we're using the East of England arable basis, I'm pretty certain we were 80% plus a grade A land in the county council estate, because I know how difficult it was for us to get a solar farm up and running because we didn't want to use the best land. That is nowhere near that figure for the East of England. So is that to be taken into account as well, or do they have like three separate figures and you self-adjust for your own thing? So really, it does look like we need to check out the benchmarking on that one. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sure that's been noted. Thank you. Do you want to come back, Stephen?
Chair, I just wanted. Didn't think it was working. I am on. I thought it might be helpful to make a comment about Councillor Goldsack's question in regards to Strategic Programme Management Office. I may have a different view on whether or not we had an effective Strategic Programme Management Office under previous management arrangements than we currently do. I think an awful lot of the teams that were involved in that area are more generic in their skill set than specific in programme management capabilities. What I can reassure committee about, however, is now that Sue's taken up her role as Executive Director of Strategy and Partnerships, we are currently looking at how we redesign that area to ensure that we do have a proper programme management office running across the authority's key programmes. That also links back to the conversation members have had earlier today on the communities function, I think communities particularly. So just to reassure members, there is work around the redesign and reshaping of those areas now that we've moved them into the new directorate. That will also be complemented by the new service director for policy and communities that we've recently appointed. The name is not yet in the public domain, but that individual has extensive experience of running those types of operations, both within central and local government. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Very quickly, Mark, and then I'm going to go.
Well, with respect to Stephen, I actually made a request for the output of the PMO to come back to this committee, because this is where this line reports, so that we can see some evidence that the PMO is working, and therefore, as I said, see some sort of dashboard evidence of what's going on across the board. Is that possible at the earliest convenience? I'm not saying in the next quarter, next 6 months, you know, at the earliest convenience. Is that possible?
Chair, apologies if I wasn't perhaps explicit enough. My view is the PMO is not operating effectively at the moment. The production of a dashboard like that isn't within their capabilities. That's why it's being redesigned. Thank you.
Thank you. Graham.
Thanks, Chair. I just want to go back to things Councillor Bowden were talking about, procurement and waivers. I fully agree with his concern. He did raise it at audit and accounts, and I'm delighted with the comments that Stephen has made. I just point out to members that on page 251, there's a lot of activity going on in this area already. So I'm hopeful that once those actions recommended by internal audit are undertaken, we will see a significant reduction in the number of waivers. But this is something which we definitely need to keep an eye on, and the work that Stephen has referred to would be very helpful in that.
Thank you. Tom.
Just very quickly, I wanted to supplement that and give Claire to possibly give her an opportunity to do so as well. But we've heard a suggestion around the kind of top-down approach to this, and currently the Section 151 officer does look at all waivers above 25k. But we've had extensive discussion about this at Procurement Governance Board as well, and we, as Councillor Wilson has alluded to, there are, I think, a number of angles on this around how we get the culture right around the timeliness of submitting waivers, the impact that the central procurement team can have on and the work that's progressing in terms of the procurement pipeline, and the input from internal audit in terms of an insurance piece, looking from bottom up at some of those individual waivers. And I think the really registering the thing at Procurement Governance Board was sort of breaking down on the departmental basis where we may have patterns and problems with this particular metric, and service directors represented at the board very keen to kind of take that on and push the message further in their individual teams.
Thank you, Tom. I think Claire is happy that you've covered it by the look of it. Councillor Count.
Thank you, Chair. I want to move us on to a new one, please. This is on page 256, and this is the indicator with the staff feeling valued by the council. This is the indicator with the staff feeling valued by the council, as demonstrated through an employee engagement survey. That, in my opinion, and I'm not running this council either as a member or as a chief executive, so it's just my opinion, the two biggest factors, the two biggest dangers for delivery of services to this council is, one is inflation eroding what little we have, and the second is having the staff to fulfill their duties both through direct employment and indirect employment. I've made this comment many times. I made it earlier on in the meeting today about what is our retention strategy, our recruitment strategy, how are we warmly embracing the ones that we already have there and trying to keep them, and what are we doing to attract new people. And I get lots of answers telling us how we're working on it, how important it is. But then I am disappointed when we look at indicator 187, proportion of staff feeling valued by the council. So the reason I say that, it isn't because of the one individual reading we've got, which was done in June 2021, it's 59%, nowhere near high enough. But there was a commitment for it to be a 12-monthly engagement. It was not done in June 2022. There was a discussion between joint admin and CLT. I don't know what those discussions were, but they decided not to do it, and they're going to move it to possibly early next year. This isn't new. There were earlier ones done in 2017 and 2020, so it's hardly something we've really grown accustomed to doing. It's not, this isn't, I'm not going down a political line here. Everybody's got failings in this area, both previous administration and this administration. It's something that is vital to this organisation to change. All right, we have to, first of all, get our staff happier. you have to be higher than 59%. And second of all, you have to be able to tell you that the actions you've taken are doing that. So the first thing I would suggest is agree to a regular programme of staff engagement on this, not this, it's all right to delay it. The second thing I would suggest is actually move away from what seems to be individual questions and engagement and adopt a recognised metric in this, such as the net, I forget my acronyms now, it's ENPS. So net promoter score is used by businesses, and then when you want to use it for your employees, it's the ENPS. So this is widely used and it's recognised, and then you can compare yourself and benchmark yourself against other comparable people, and it's well established. That's the point. We don't get to choose our questions. We don't go to say to them, how are you feeling? Are you feeling respected this year? Which is the question that we've got. We go to an ENPS, which has a wide range of metrics. So I ask that we take a high level approach to this, the joint administration take a higher level approach, decide, is it appropriate, put it on a permanent, regular footing, and then perhaps consider whether it needs changing to something that helps us to measure ourselves against other people. But I really think that our employee base, our officers, are the ones that are going to help us run a good quality organisation. So this is really important work. Not that anything else isn't, but I really think this is important to us. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Do you want? Yes, Stephen.
Chair, thank you to Councillor Count. Absolutely endorse the comments he's made about the importance of these indicators and how our staff feel as part of this organisation. I think at the last meeting of the Strategy and Resources Committee, when we discussed this indicator, I advised that we would be looking to commission a full employee survey during the course of the early part of next year. That's something we're still working towards. More importantly, however, we will be pulling this together as part of the revised people strategy. So I think just refer to some of my earlier remarks today, but the notion of measuring this and looking at things like employee net promoter score is definitely something we should be doing with a recognised independent body that leads that for us, rather than us doing that internally. I have to also say, in discussion with the corporate leadership team, one of the things we've been slightly concerned about is the timing of that. We've surveyed our staff for a number of reasons throughout the course of the year for a number of different issues which contribute towards their overall engagement. But what we haven't yet done is one single survey that asks for their overall perception of working with the council. I think that's the way we need to be going forward. So we will be commissioning that early in the new year. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Apologize. Thank you, Chair. Very, very quickly. I mean, I think this is a point that's actually quite important, and I would like to offer some perspective based on my experience and people I know's experience of workplaces other than this. So like my own and other people that I know. The way in which you survey your employees and the way in which you measure the mood and set your targets in terms of, you know, employee happiness and all of these other things has changed very radically in the last few years. It's something that companies are finding more difficult to do because the stuff that they have to ask about is changing. So while I absolutely endorse the need to do this and do this quickly and do this properly, the work that is needed to do something acceptable now is rather different than what was needed 2 years ago. And this is something we should acknowledge. And that was the only thing I would like to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't see any other comments, so I'm going to make a couple. Firstly, on the, I absolutely agree with what's just been said about the importance of staff feeling valued by the council. I am a little bit reassured to see that in the actions at the bottom of that section, it does say that the next employee engagement survey on Respect at Work will be in January 2023. So that reinforces what Stephen has just said, I think, and I hope that that does take place in January 2023. And then we will be able to see at least a similar thing, but I also accept that it would be very good to have to use an external survey. So I think that's a helpful comment. The other indicator that I wanted to comment on was the percentage of requests which are resolved at first contact, which I think I commented on when this report last came before us, because it was very good at that point, and it's now a tiny bit less good than it was before. And it does say in the commentary underneath that some of that is to do with the beginning of the school year and more complex questions about the start of the school year. But I think it is one of the most important of these. I mean, all of the indicators are important, but that's one that I'm particularly keen that we continue to track. So I will be interested to see where that is when it next comes back to us. It does also say in the commentary on that indicator that as more and more of our inquiries become digital, we may see that indicator falling, and it would be if it does continue to fall, then it would be useful to try and understand whether that's because the nature of the inquiries has changed or whether it's other factors, because I think that's one I'm keen to see following, and while it's still green, I wouldn't want to see it declining any further. Thank you. I don't see any other comments, so I think we have noted that report. We are asked to review and agree proposed additions and removals to the corporate services key performance indicators. I don't think there are any changes, so we've noted and commented on the report, I think. So thank you very much to Tom and the team on those. Michelle, we are now over our 2-hour thing, so I'm sorry that we've gone over. We will now take a 10-minute break in order to give Michelle a break, but I think if we just make it 10 minutes on this occasion, because there isn't too much left on our agenda, and then I hope that we can get done by lunchtime. So thank you. I made that maybe over hopeful, we'll see. So we'll come back at 2029, is that right? Shall we restart, everyone, on the basis that then we're more likely to finish, which would be good? Thank you, Michelle. So the next item is item 8, which is the Treasury Management Report Q2, and we will go back to Stephen. Thank you, Stephen.
Hello again. So this is the Treasury Management update. So the Council's Treasury Management Strategy, which forms part of the business plan, requires quarterly updates on the Council's Treasury Management position, essentially its cash, investments and borrowing, to be considered by members. 2 of those updates, the end of year one and this mid-year one, need to be reviewed by full council as well. So this report presents the Q2 update to this committee and asks that it is recommended upwards on to be considered by full council. So the key aspect of this report is the set of treasury and prudential indicators set out in Appendix 1. These KPIs are set and monitored against and give overview of whether the council's treasury management is remaining within prudent limits. The body of the report in turn sets out our position on investments and cash management, borrowing and capital financing budget, some of which we've discussed in the previous finance report as well. So overall, briefly, the council's cash position is relatively healthy at the moment, due particularly to front loading of government grants, which leads on to lower than expected borrowing requirement. When we are taking out borrowing, interest rates are increasing, the effects of which will be built into the capital financing budget for next year. And a consequence of rising rates has been an increasing use of short-term borrowing this year, which tends to have slightly more favourable rates. These reports usually set out at some length the economic context at the end of the relevant quarter, which can be out of date by the time it gets to committee. And in particular, at the end of Q2, we were in the middle of the reaction to the Truss government's mini budget. And so the economic context is quite different to today and is sort of set out in much more brief form in the report than usual. So the key points really from this report, therefore, are the compliance with the prudential indicators and the parameters of the Treasury Management Strategy. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Questions and comments on this report? I don't think I see any. Thank you very much, Stephen. That was brief. Okay. I think in that case, we've noted the Treasury Management Report Q2, and we will endorse it for consideration to full council. Anybody want to object to that? I see no objections, so I think that will move forward unanimously. Thank you very much indeed, Stephen. And then we come to the agenda plan. Gosh, we really nearly could have done this. Michelle, the agenda and training plan. And I know that Sue wants to say something on the training plan, but Michelle, do you want to do the agenda plan first?
I have no update to the agenda plan since it was published.
Thank you. And then Sue.
And on the training plan, just to say there's an item there about social value in procurement. So I'll be picking that up and ensuring that that is scheduled. Also taking account of environmental factors in procurement. And just from conversations with members over recent weeks, also like to propose that we rerun the session that we did, I think over a year ago now, but on personal safety for members. And also I'd like to make a suggestion as well about doing a session on the corporate complaints process and how the corporate complaints process can assist members in handling sort of their inboxes really, and how we can work together as officers and members in dealing with responses from members of the public. So there are a couple of other items, but I've spoken with Michelle and I'd quite like to pick that up and start working on that training plan for members. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think that brings us to the end of the meeting. So thank you very much, members, for being here today. And I would like to wish everybody a very happy Christmas, because I don't think we'll be in again. So happy Christmas all, and see you in January. Thank you.